Welcome to the Industry 4.0 podcast with Grantek.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to a bonus episode of the Industry 4.0 podcast with Grantek. Industry 4.0 podcast with Grantek delivers a look into the world of manufacturing with a focus on stories and trends that lead to better solutions. I guess share tips and outcomes that will help improve your productivity. Today, I'm joined by Jim Toman from Grantek. Jim is an MES expert with over 30 years of experience. Jim's done a lot of his career helping food and beverage manufacturers navigate regulatory changes and upcoming FSMA. And we're going to be talking about that a lot today. FSMA Rule 204 coming January 2026. So good chance to have some good conversation with Jim today and look at some of the changes that he sees and some of the requirements that come from it and how manufacturers are dealing with this new regulatory thing. So thanks, Jim, for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we do this, I do love on these shows to hear just a little bit about every guest's kind of career, their stories, how they got into the industry, how they where they started, how they got to where they are now, and just wondering if you can. And Jim's my former boss too, by the way. I worked for him when I was in continuous improvement role at Grantek, so it's kind of fun to say now. Like, tell me about yourself, Jim, for our guests, your story, how you got started, and
Yeah, not a problem at all. It's great to be here to talk a little bit about this, but also great to talk with you again, Dave. So, congrats on the podcast.
Thank you.
So, as far as my career is concerned, my background going way back is actually in software and systems development. That's where I began my career. And most of my work in the early days was in creating data-driven systems back when it was still pretty nascent. It was a new thing. MES is something that we started to call it probably a decade into my career already. I was already working with different manufacturers, different kinds of companies that did different things, and helping them to improve their manufacturing operations and increase their ability to account for where things were with data, as well as understand performance and various other aspects. So as I moved through my career, I spent a lot more time with companies on the food and beverage side of things. Being located where I was in California, we had a lot of manufacturers in food and bev, but also working across North America earlier on in my career. It seems like food and beverage is a pretty common thread across most of the country. So I spent a lot of time in food and beverage environments, everything from taking produce from the field and packaging it all the way up through different kinds of actual cooking and packaging and mixing and all different kinds of things that were done for various kinds of products. So I kind of like to say, if there's a food factory in the US, there's a pretty good chance I've been inside of it. It's been pretty interesting to see all the different things. So as my career progressed, I then was able to take those skills and that knowledge and move globally with it. So I've been in different parts of the world working on food and beverage systems, including things like cocoa powder production out in the Philippines, milk and cheese in New Zealand, meat production in Australia, and ice cream over in Europe, and various other kinds of things as well.
Cool.
So lots of different things. It's kind of nice being able to see how people do things in different parts of the world. Helped educate me even more on what things people have to watch out for and how they do it. And of course, as the Food Safety Modernization Act started to come into being back in, I guess it's been a little bit over a decade now that people first started seeing that as a real thing, I started looking at it much more closely and started talking with folks on the quality side of things and food safety as well. Started to try to understand it better back then and began to talk about it out in the broader world. There's an interesting intersection between the work that we do on manufacturing systems and lots of different aspects of food safety, as you well know, because you work in the label verification side of things, which is one aspect of food safety, making sure that the labels are right on product. Traceability is pretty near and dear to my heart. It's one of the things that I've spent a lot of time on in the MES space, and it's one of the things I've spent a bit of time studying on the FSMA side of things. And looking forward to talking about that with you today.
Yeah, and traceability, I mean, really ties into to FSMA 204 and the final rule that's been released, specifically called the final rule. So for those listeners who kind of haven't heard about it, the FDA has released a list of foods, the food traceability list, the FTL. Everything gets a new acronym here, but if stuff's on the FTL, which is there's a lot of produce on it. There's fresh herbs, tomatoes, cucumbers, that kind of stuff, fish type product. But there's also from the process side, it's soft cheese and nut butters are listed in there. So if you are on that list, you do need to store key data elements, KDEs, at different points in the manufacturing process and shipping and receiving. So each time you ship, receive, or transform a product, you're required to collect these key data elements, and you're required to send this information at each critical tracking event. So you collect the key data at critical tracking events, and those are receiving, transforming, shipping. And you're also supposed to have within 24 hours traceability records to the FDA in electronic sortable spreadsheet format. So anybody who's still hanging in there on paper is going to have a very, very tough time really meeting that requirement, or if you've got bits and pieces of paper. So that's in a nutshell the requirement, and all of that data. I guess the other piece I'm missing here is all of that data needs to be sent downstream. So every piece in the supply chain is kind of passing the data downstream to the next person who picks it up. So you're sending stuff from the manufacturing site to the warehousing, and then if you ship it to your customer's distribution center, you're sending them advanced shipment notices with all the relevant information they need to have, and then it kind of just keeps carrying downstream. So significant change to the industry. And so how do you see this kind of playing out? What do you see as some of the challenges manufacturers are facing on it? How are they addressing it with traceability systems and MES, and kind of what are you seeing around FSMA 204?
That's a great question. So it's an interesting study in the differences between large, well-funded companies and smaller companies. Big companies that have been early and have been looking at this closely for a long time. We're talking about, huge drivers of industry. They have been trying to figure out how to manage this stuff electronically for a long time. Smaller companies, smaller suppliers are in a bit of a different position, because for them, the added cost and the added, let's just say, overhead of managing electronic systems probably didn't factor much into how they were operating. And especially when we start talking about fresh food producers, the common saying in the industry now is like farm to fork, right? We want to track everything from farm to fork, which means that we need data from the place where the raw material comes out of the ground as produce, and data across the entire supply chain all the way to the point at which the consumer buys the product, and sometimes even past that if there's a recall. So it's an interesting landscape, and what I will say about it is, having looked at this for some time, the integration of that data pipeline, let's just say, is not great. The current state of it is not fantastic. It's not easy, actually. And so what the goal of FSMA is to take what has historically been a clumsy, somewhat opaque process, and has been rather difficult sometimes to get the information needed to pinpoint where issues have popped up and to figure out the scope of a recall, which sometimes could take days or weeks, especially with companies that use paper. The goal is for the government to say, hey, it's got to be available to us within 24 hours. We need to know, if people are getting sick, we want to know within 24 hours exactly where that food came from, exactly which places it passed through, exactly what was done to it, what all the source materials were, so that we can then issue a pinpoint recall that is accurate. Hard to do, easy to say, really hard to do, especially when you have manufacturers across the supply chain that are that are not integrated with one another. And so there is an opportunity across that supply chain for companies to create, overall ledger software, if you will, but that's not really what this rule is specifying. What this rule is specifying is for each contributor in the supply chain to be able to know and produce that information on its own for the steps that occurred within its, let's just say, four walls. Although if we're out in a farm field, it's not four walls, but within its scope of responsibility. So if you have a scenario where, for example, you have produce being picked at a farm, there is a traceability requirement at the farm to say, hey, it was picked on this day in this place. There's certain key data elements that have to be produced that follow from the activities that take place on that farm. They're called critical tracking events that are kind of the framework that holds this whole thing together. And you could say the same thing with dairy, for example. Where did this source milk come from? When was it produced? At what time and in what place? And then it's transported in trucks. So there's another tracking event. There's transport taking place, loading and unloading. And then it's brought into a production facility, usually, where it's bottled or transformed into something else. Maybe it's transformed into whey powder. Maybe it's transformed into cheese, yogurt, all different kinds of things. And those transformation events that take place within the four walls of a factory, a production plant, if you will, where we're taking something in, let's just say it's milk. We're taking raw and pasteurized milk in. We're going through the pasteurization process. We are separating components of it out, perhaps. We are then doing something to it so that it becomes a different kind of product. And then we're packaging that product up. Sometimes we're dividing it, packaging it up. Maybe we're storing it for a little while. All of those things are data elements that are part of a food safety chain. The good news is, so now that that's kind of a long story to tell, the good news is that in many of those cases, those are situations where the production process can be managed by a competent manufacturing execution system, or MES. And an MES system has the ability to not just facilitate the work that's being done, in other words, determining how to coordinate when to open valves to move product from place to place, or determining how long a particular thing has to be in a particular state at a particular temperature, or any of those kinds of things. But it also keeps track of lot numbers. It keeps track of the particular raw ingredients that went into that. And it does all of that as a byproduct of the processing that takes place. So no longer are we in a case with MES systems where we have to have somebody who is responsible for writing that information down at every step, and you better hope they're there, and you better hope they wrote it down correctly. Instead of that, we now have these transformation events that are taking place electronically. They're being managed by the system, and the system is making an electronic record of those events as they occur, so that in the event that there is a recall, or in the event that a quality test doesn't pan out well before the product leaves the four walls of the plant, you can identify very quickly through essentially a database query. You can find out very rapidly where was that particular product through the entire chain of operations inside that plant.
Okay.
So
I guess a question to that, because there's a little bit of leeway in some of this, that if you are producing something or using something that's from the food traceability list. So are you seeing manufacturers, so cheese is near and dear to my heart, cheese, big cheese fan.
Mine as well.
Spend a lot of time in cheese facilities. So on the good news side for cheese, or I guess the good news / lighter side for manufacturers, is milk's not on the list now. So you really only need, once it becomes cheese, you need to know all about it, do all your FSMA. Are you seeing companies implement an MES to handle FSMA 204? And hey, we're going to put the inputs to this. We don't need to do the milk right now, but we're going to put that in anyways, because we've already built this system that's going to handle the outputs, and that's going to handle or or not? Or are those being tied together? Or people trying to get ahead of this and saying, well, the next step is they're going to put the inputs in, so we might as well get it all done kind of a once piece? Or how do you see companies kind of handling that?
That's a good question too. So up to recently, the motivation to do this stuff electronically has been around efficiency. It's been around the idea, and not just efficiency, but accuracy. So if you look at the way these systems have been funded in the past, it's typically around making their processes better more than anything. There's an opportunity for risk reduction in it for sure, but mostly it's around being able to produce more with the same equipment, or being able to produce at a faster rate with what we're doing, and more clearly, more safely, more accurately with the data that's being produced. So it's
the number of batches lost from incorrect hand adds or incorrect dosing of stuff from silos in, or oops, I used that's one we hear over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
I hear from customers about raw material verification. Someone's adding
For
the wrong
sure.
powders, someone's adding the wrong quantity from the super sack of whey powder or whatever it is, and you're right, to your point, you're going to catch that. If you can use FSMA as your excuse to go to the board and get the money you need, or whoever you got to go to get your money, then you can catch that at the same time. And then your point, you're going to get a yield, and you're going to get potentially a productivity improvement because things just move faster, but you're also going to get a productivity improvement because you're not having to throw stuff out because someone did the misformulation.
Yeah, for sure. So it's important to realize that, FSMA Section 204 is really all about traceability. But if you think about it in terms of the regulatory mandate, which there is, and you're right, it's for a selected group of things. So companies that are not doing things that are on the traceability list are less mandated, if you will, to have to produce a solution. Doesn't mean they shouldn't produce a solution. And it also doesn't mean that companies that produce things that are upstream of something on the traceability list shouldn't have a solution, because there's also risk management there. But food safety is a really large scope of potential applications. When we talk about MES, you hit on a couple of them for sure. The goal in doing this, beyond just productivity improvements, which is the standard go-to for most kinds of electronic systems in manufacturing, the goal here is to make sure we reduce the risks of things like undeclared allergens, for example, biological contaminants in the food, and adulterants, other kinds of adulterants. Like what happens, for example, and this is another use case that I've seen that leads to food safety. Pretty much every food production line I've ever been involved with has some kind of an X-ray system at the end of it.
Yep.
The reason for that is because why? It's because equipment can break. And when equipment breaks, you can get things in the food that don't belong there. But if you look at the kinds of processing equipment that exist in factories today, it's not all metal. So what happens if you break off big chunks of plastic? That X-ray system's not going to find it. So when you're talking about different things that can end up in food that shouldn't be in food, you want to have different ways of catching that. And capable MES systems now have some tools that can help do that in other ways. So we are starting to see, and I'm starting to see, people asking about different solutions that were created for other reasons. Things like, in being able to do a maintenance on a piece of equipment before it reaches the point at which it's actually going to fail. So we call that predictive maintenance. That is normally just to avoid downtime in most manufacturing, but in a food environment, it's a real food safety risk. And that's something that can be done as part of an overall food safety plan that then keeps track of that information about when equipment was changed out, so that when we talk about traceability, even though that might not be a particular key data element or a particular critical tracking event, it's another factor that you can very quickly look at and say, okay, we had a food safety issue with this product. A customer opened a box and there was something in there that shouldn't have been in there. Did we PM our machines? Were we warned? Right? And you can go back and look and see.
Predictive maintenance as a food safety. That's I have not heard that one, but it makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you want things, all the food safety, it tests your food safety procedures, but it really tests your company as a whole. Do your
It does.
people follow procedures? Is your equipment in a good state of repair? Is your equipment, your sanitation processes sufficient? Are your changeover processes correct? Are your labeling marking processes correct? Is your warehousing processes correct? And this is some of what I'm seeing at companies is little air quotes for those of you listening. You can't see my air quotes on a podcast. It really tests all of your processes and procedures across your company, even for little things like your code dating practices.
Mm.
What's your changeover practice on code daters? What's your changeover practice on primary package code data versus secondary package code data versus declaring that pallet as a finished good into your ERP system? Are all those lined up? Are you doing line clearances there? And that's where I'm seeing with some companies, they're being tested like not before. No one really, and I guess that's a question to you. You mentioned large manufacturers have sort of been looking at this for a while. They've been looking at this for a while. They've been planning for this for a while, or they've been taking steps. So they already have. I mean, big companies have a lot of electronic traceability in. Whether how far and how deep it goes is a question mark at times. But there's stuff there at any significant company. Is this really this, at least what I've seen, is it's really testing those systems and the business practices that feed in? There's a garbage in, garbage out kind of thing. Are those business practices robust? Are they matching the data that's being entered into the system? Are you seeing that? Are you seeing that some of these systems are there, but they're not used properly, or companies are having to remediate stuff? Because now it's like the rubber really hits the road and someone's going to pull this kind of stuff. And now you're passing that data downstream to someone who really needs it to be correct. Or is that challenging manufacturers, or are they, yeah, they put big systems in and they're kind of there? How are you seeing that?
Well, the traceability mandate under Section 204 is changing that game a little bit. It's changing the definition of the risk that a company has to some extent. In that, again, and I want to be very clear here, there is no mandate that says you must do all of the tracking electronically. That's not
Yep.
in the rule. However, having said that, your opportunity to make really bad mistakes is very high if you're not using electronic systems for this. So, and it's never said, but it's kind of like looking at this as somebody who's been in this space for 3 decades. They want you to be doing this electronically. It's the only thing that can produce this kind of speed that they're asking for, a 24-hour turnaround for records. I remember, in fact, just to tell a quick story, a small food manufacturer that I was in California a couple decades ago now. It's been a while. They were focused on automating some of their production processes, and they actually had a recall event that took place while I was doing some work there. And one of the things that I noticed as they were going through that is when that recall event hit, it took them weeks. They had people pulling huge files out of a file room. I mean, papers. They basically took over. They kicked me out of the conference room.
You make a war room, right? And then
they kicked me out of the conference room and brought in a whole bunch of folks with just reams and reams and reams of paper records. And it took them a long time to pour through those records to figure out what they were looking for. No way were they going to get the information they needed in 24 hours if it was in the file cabinet. It wasn't going to happen. So today, if that mandate is there, that poses a special challenge to companies that are not as technology forward. And I'm thinking about it in terms of kind of the evolution of systems over the last little while. Let's say the last decade or so. There's been a much higher adoption of cloud-based systems. There's been a much higher adoption of systems that do data collection remotely and then send data to servers that are not necessarily on site. There's subscription-based services now. There's all kinds of things that you can do if you're not in a company that's prepared to own the technology on site, or what we call on premises. You can actually put together a system that you can have someone help you put together a system that will then move the data offsite, but in a secure way, so that it's available to you in the event that something takes place, but it's not something that you have to worry about maintaining yourself. You don't have to do those things. And then in terms of actually collecting the data, if it's for targeted record keeping purposes, you can have a very thin layer of data collection underneath that. Not heavy, not expensive. And for the areas where you want to know what people did, for example, to use your recent example, let's say, did they run sanitation when they were supposed to? Well, provide what we call a paper on glass sanitation checklist that is easy for someone to do, easy for them to complete. It tracks who did it, when they did it, what equipment they did it on. And that record then becomes part of that critical data set, which is not anything that you have to worry about maintaining. You don't have to worry about the database side of it. You can just create a report when you need it that says, did we do the things we were supposed to do? Yes or no? And that facilitates the process. It's got to that point now. I would say 20 years ago, you were ordering a custom solution to do that. Today, that's the kind of thing where it probably comes with something that's mostly out of the box. Like you could tweak it a little bit and it could do most of what
all these no code, low code. Well, no code and low code is it's a real thing. I believe it to a point. You're going to hit a point where and this you're right. There's a ton more options, and some of these things really can be deployed very quickly because you can just run it on the cloud, and then you put some computer on the plant floor that can connect to the cloud, and away you go, kind of thing. And I am a believer in this no code, low code stuff, because I've seen, at least the biggest place I'm personally using this is in Power BI and some of the tools for transforming data and pieces like that. You can do some really heavy stuff that would have been complicated, very complicated SQL database queries, and yeah, you can do it by click, type a bit, click, a little bit of scripting. So there are, to your point, a lot better tools to handle doing this that can be deployed a lot faster without the infrastructure, and a lot quicker and a lot lighter potentially, just to solve kind of points of these issues. Just another point on, we talked a lot about electronic traceability and record keeping and MES. Are you seeing the big other trend I'm seeing on this is changes to case labeling, case marking, because now we're tracking these cases. Well, someone at some point is going to be breaking all those pallets apart and mixing and matching and so on and so forth. And there's a bit of there's no direct requirement from the FDA on how you mark those cases, other than, yeah, you have to put the information, the FSMA information on it. So the lot code and the product description and quantities, unit of measure, that kind of stuff. Are you seeing the one way to do this is GS1 128, which GS1 is kind of pitching themselves as a data carrier platform that is common or could be common across everybody. Are you seeing GS1 128? Are you seeing people not using that? Are you seeing other, or are you hearing about how people are handling case marking, case labeling, the physical side, the physical data transfer, more air quotes, physical data transfer downstream versus the electronic? What are you seeing on that?
Yeah, so lots of different things. A lot depends upon where the product is destined. Walmart, for example, has been a prime mover in this space. Product that goes to them has to have a specific set of requirements followed, or they won't take it. And so the kind of labeling that's mandated in order to supply to them is the kind of thing that a lot of other people have tried to piggyback off of as well, because if they're demanding it, then there's something already there. It's something we can do, etc. The GS1 labels are really useful in that they are essentially a database record on a box. They're the kind of thing that the data are encoded in the label itself. And the only real challenge to that is if the box gets damaged to the degree that the label is no longer readable, you kind of break the chain a little bit, but there are ways to work to avoid that if it's really critical. What I haven't seen in food yet, that doesn't mean it isn't coming, but what I haven't seen in the food space yet is the kind of thing that you sometimes get in life sciences or pharmaceuticals, medical device, where you're trying to trace individual units all the way through to the destination. Cases maybe is kind of where it ends in food for the most part. And there might be some special cases that I'm totally unaware of. It's a huge domain.
Sure.
But the reality is that most of what I still see today tends to be pallet based. Are we sending a certain pallet of goods and how many were on the pallet and so on?
I think on the electronic side, what I'm hearing is you've got to put some of that. You have to put that batch and lot and location and et cetera information on that case label, because someone at some point in the grocery store, in the food service establishment, they're breaking that. They're getting a broken pallet that's a mix of 5 different SKUs, and they're the one. FSMA is a lot about trace back. So if 20 people got sick from a restaurant, that restaurant's hopefully knows what they received or what they have. Well, I guess they're required to know what they received and what they have. So they'll be able to say, and they need to know what they still have. So they've got those shipper cases marked with those batch.
Yeah, as long as that traceability is on the label, then you can take that back to the supplier where that label came from and go through their process, and they can trace back from the suppliers they got things from and so on. So there's a chain, and chain is important here. What doesn't exist in a widely accepted way at this point in time is like a universal blockchain that has, everything from beginning to end in it, where you can just quickly hit a button and bang, you can see everything that fed into it and everywhere it went. That would be like kind of the holy grail of the whole traceability equation. Maybe that'll settle out over the next decade or two. It's not an impossibility from a technical perspective, but there's a lot of underlying things. And that's mostly what we're talking about today, is those underlying things that have to work in order to create something like that could be used in a universal sense. And there's probably a bunch more government regulation that's going to drive that too, unless there's a significant driver from an ease and convenience standpoint, from industry. So I don't know, but
I mean, I know in pharma you see more of this, and I think some products I'm going to say outside of US, other countries where counterfeiting is an issue, there's a bigger driver for that, even to the point where customer can check the authenticity of their product and scan and pick that up, and it's interesting to see if blockchain stuff. I don't know why, this is completely off topic, but I don't know why blockchain stuff isn't on. I mean, some luxury goods not that luxury goods people want you reselling, but to verify authenticity of resold luxury goods or something like that, where there is massive counterfeiting problems and there's huge value in trust. And if you did have these electronic, maybe I think it is, and potentially in some places being looked at, but I don't know why that's more widespread for goods that are resold and luxury and vulnerable to counterfeiting. But
it seems like there's an opportunity, right?
I know in the food manufacturers, just any change is hard because you've got these old plants and and you don't have space to add new stuff most of the time, and it's a challenge to make change and update processes and procedures for them. So for sure, I think, a lot of this has to be regulatory driven in the end.
Maybe we'll see something like that with high-end cheese.
There you go. Yes, you can scan your cheese and see the story of it and tell which farm it came from, and could be. I imagine somebody's doing that already, and we just don't know. Track my cheese.
We're just unaware at this point, right?
Trackmycheese.com. Let's get that. We'll buy it, Jim. You and I. Let's do it right now. Well, excellent. Well, Jim, thank you very much for some good conversation on FSMA and some good discussion about the changes in the regulatory environment and changes in MES. And I think I like your preventative maintenance as a food safety. I have not thought of that. I hear a lot of talk of preventative maintenance, and the AI is going to tell you. But you don't want your conveyor breaking up into your product or your mixer paddles disintegrating in your product or any of that. And your opportunities to catch that are hard or harder, let's say, than if it's any metal kind of components. So great conversation, and thanks for coming on this bonus podcast episode.
Absolutely. It's been wonderful to be here. Good to see you again.
Perfect. Well, thank you to everyone listening. Would love to hear from you, hear any feedback about this episode or ideas for future episodes. Please follow Grantek on LinkedIn to stay up to date with everything we're doing. Subscribe to the Industry 4.0 podcast with Grantek, wherever you get your podcast from. And if you have any questions, feedback, thoughts, do email info@grantek, GRANTEK.com. And please join us again next time on the Industry 4.0 podcast with Grantek.